A very good morning to our esteemed panel members and our virtual audience. I am Ipsita Shukla from the Impact Policy and Advocacy team of Earth, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of Earth Foundation's welfare initiative, Earth Prerna. Earth Prerna believes in building hope through education. Today marks the official launch of our initiative. But before we head to our launch, I'm extremely delighted to welcome you all to this wonderful panel discussion. I extend my salutations to our moderator, our panel members, and our esteemed audience. As we're all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic held the world hostage and to adversities that created a permanent dent in the lives of people, especially pushing the marginalized further into the margins. Arguably, one of the worst repercussions of the pandemic was faced by the children. The National Commission for Protection of Child Rights reported that 10,000 children were orphaned, about 1 lakh children lost either of their parents to the novel coronavirus, and 488 children were abandoned since the April of 2020. The situation for these children is surely frightening. These striking facts and figures have led us together today to hold a discussion on the theme COVID-19 associated orphanhood that aims to discuss about the status of this orphanhood and extend a child-sensitive lens towards COVID-19 and conclude sustainable solutions for such children. To grace our panel discussions with their experiences and noble perspectives, I'd now like to introduce our panel speakers for today. Our first panel member is Ms. Soledad Herrero, the Chief of Child Protection of India, UNICEF. Ms. Sol has worked for UNICEF and other international agencies and organizations for the last 15 years in 4 continents: Latin America, Africa, UNICEF headquarters in New York, and now in Asia, in India. During her career, she's worked with UN and civic society organizations on a myriad of issues ranging from legal reform, justice for children, ending violence, child marriage, alternative care reform, etc. Sol holds a master's in international public policy from Johns Hopkins University, an LLM in human rights from the University of London, and a Juris Doctorate and a business administration from Spain. It is an absolute pleasure to have you with us, ma'am. Our second panel member for today is Ms. Puja Marwaha, the CEO of Child Rights in You, an organization widely known for leadership building and governance initiatives aimed at children welfare since 1994. Ms. Puja has envisioned and built an organizational framework for CRI that captures the essence of justice, equity, and representation of the needs of the children in the larger society. She's also part of the board of VANI, Volunteer Action Network India, which is an endeavor that works to strengthen public mobilization for social causes. Extending my deepest welcome to you, ma'am. Our third panel member for today is Mr. Sudarshan Suchi, a seasoned civil society leader with both local and global experience in academics, development, and corporate settings. He's also an authority in the participatory communities that empower to lead transformation. He's played a lot of leadership profiles with the Reliance Foundation, Reliance Life Services, and is now serving as the CEO of Save the Children India. We welcome you, sir. Our fourth panel member is Ms. Smriti Gupta, the co-founder and CEO of Where Are India's Children. Where Are India's Children is an NGO focused on serving and protecting India's orphaned and abandoned. Through this platform, Ms. Smriti focuses on ensuring that every eligible orphan child reaches the legal adoption route. It is definitely a pleasure to have you with us, ma'am. Now, last but definitely not the least, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Ms. Sonal Kapoor, the founder director of Protsahan India Foundation, an organization based out of New Delhi, India, that works on bridging the gap in childcare systems by introducing an empathy-based system called the Heart Model. Ms. Sonal is an esteemed Ashoka Fellow, Vital Voices Fellow, and World Bank Fellow. She has pursued child protection law from National Law School of India University and Harvard University. She's won several national and international honors in the field of child welfare. Protsahan, under her leadership, has rescued over 950 girls and reaches out to more than 81,000 vulnerable children and adolescent girls.
You're very welcome, ma'am. Now I request all the attendees who have joined in, I extend my welcome to you. And I would request you to please put your questions throughout the discussion in the Q&A segment, which is on your right. And now I'll be handing over the floor to Ms. Sonal. Please, let's begin this discussion. And welcome all of you once again.
Thank you very much. So I have the privilege to start the conversation.
Sure. The moderator is Ms. Sonal Kapoor, but please go ahead.
Okay, apologies, because I heard Sole and I was wondering, wow, that's early on the program. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No. Ms. Sonal? The panel speakers
Is anybody else able to hear? Okay.
Yeah. While Ms. Sonal figures out her internet connectivity issues, I'm sure we all understand that. I request you all to please begin. Smriti ma'am, would you like to take the lead?
Of course, sure. So, I can talk a little bit about the work our organization has been doing and what we've been finding. So we are specifically talking about COVID-associated orphanhood. And what our organization does, we are working in Telangana and Maharashtra in several districts. And we are looking at abandoned and orphan children who end up in child shelters. That's our area of focus, children who are not with their primary families. And what we have realized in our work is that a lot of orphans, approximately close to 70% of orphans who end up in shelters, they do have a relative listed on paper. And what this has done essentially on the ground for these children who are orphans is that even if their guardian, the relative who's listed, even if that person does not visit, even if they have no intention of raising the child, the children get essentially stuck in shelter. So that's one of the challenges we see on the ground of bringing eligible abandoned and orphan children into the legal adoption process is that today the way our laws are defined, it keeps any child with any known guardian on paper in a shelter without a way to move that child out of that situation. I want to share an example of a boy. This boy, he was brought in a shelter since when he was 5 years old. He is now 14. So for almost a decade, this child has spent his life moving from shelter to shelter. He's an orphan child, and he had some cousin or relative mentioned on paper. When we started working in this particular district, we started looking at this child's case, and the child shelter called the family. And the family was not interested in the child, and they were willing to surrender the child. And I think in recent week, I think that has happened. And what was the biggest, I think I would say, the heart-wrenching thing here is that this child was in a shelter for years because there was nobody bothered to say, okay, well, this is an orphan child in a shelter. Do the relatives even want this child? Should we talk to them about whether they want to raise the child? Once that that conversation happened after years, the relatives were willing to surrender. This child could have gone home when he was 5 years old. Now, a family, when he comes into the legal adoption process, he would have to find a family, or the system will have to find a family for him when he's 14. So we have like these lost 9 years for this child. Now, we also worked on a case of two sisters. Again, both of them came into orphan sisters. They came into the shelter as young children. They have had no visits for years when we started working on their case. But despite the fact that they have no visits, these girls will have to continue living in a child shelter, and they will not come into the legal adoption process because their relatives exist on paper. They have grandparents on paper who have not raised the child for years. They have not visited. So these are the type of, orphan related. And a lot of people ask us, well, there were these X number of kids who lost parents in COVID. How many kids ended up in shelters? Have they come into the legal adoption pool? And we tell people, no, something has to change legislatively for these kids to come into the legal adoption process, because today, the way some of our laws and some of our mindset is structured, we are letting orphans being left in shelters without any accountability on their relatives to either raise them, to visit them, or to show any interest. And if there is no interest, then that child has to come into the legal adoption process. That flow does not exist today. So I'll leave with like three big changes that we feel need to happen. in the JJ Act for these kids to get permanent families. The very first thing is our law today says orphans with no one to care for must be brought into the legal adoption process. Now, what is no one to care for? Are you expecting all the relatives, to not exist? That's not going to happen. Somebody will exist somewhere. So, what is no one to care for means for an orphan child in a shelter? Can we define it better? Can we put some benchmarks and responsibilities to say if this has to happen for an orphan to continue living in a shelter versus for that orphan to come into the legal adoption process? So we need to define what no one to care for means. If you have taken if you're a relative and you put a child in a shelter, you're not visiting, or if you're not interested in raising the child, you should fall into no one to care for category. But do you? And local level officials will never make that call unless the law is clear. So that's the very first thing we feel needs to be strengthened legally. Now, the second thing is we need to define abandonment more strongly. Today, abandonment is defined as deserting a child. Again, that may apply to a child left in a street or so on and so forth. But what about children who have not had any visits? So we need to define lack of any guardian visits as child abandonment. How that's defined, how that's framed, that's a policy discussion that really needs to be happen in depth. A lot of stakeholders need to come on board and have that discussion. We cannot let children sit in shelters without, relatives, without anybody visiting them forever, and have them grow and stay out of shelters and leave shelters at 18. That's not a life we should be giving children. When there are 30,000 people today are willing to adopt children, a small percentage of it are also willing to adopt older children with special needs. So why have we packed all these children in shelters that perhaps don't need to be there? And the last thing I would say, which was the case I talked about, where a child was in shelter for several years until somebody just bothered to ask their relative, do you even want the child? So this should be made a mandate. Meet a person leaving a child in a shelter and never coming back without checking on a child. That cannot be our default. There has to be some sort of legal mandate to see that, quarterly or every 6 months, in some periodic manner, we need to check with the families whether they intend to raise the child long term, whether they intend to take the child home. And this becomes especially important in the case of orphaned kids, because many times the family, immediately can't take care of the child. They may put the child in a shelter, but belatedly they may realize, no, I don't think I'm ever going to bring this child home and raise them. So they should be reminded that there is an option to surrender the child, and for that child to reach a new family if as a relative you don't want to raise that child. So okay, so I'll leave my thoughts there, but I do think that legally how orphan children in shelters who have lost both parents or whose relatives are not taking care of them proactively, we need stronger, better language in our law to bring them into the legal adoption process. And we need more intentionality on the ground with officials to say, this child needs to go into the legal adoption process because there is no one proactively raising them and nobody intends to. All right, thank you. Thanks, Upsita.
Right, ma'am. Makes sense. I would request Ms. Sonal to please take over. Ms. Puja.
Oh, okay. I couldn't hear you, so I was wondering, who did you ask?
No, please, ma'am. Please.
Yeah, so, we discussed with Sonal some of the things that we want to talk about. Right. And just to give you a very quick context, CRY's work in this space is, we fundamentally work with about 4 lakh children. We work with them and their families. And during the whole space of COVID, and I'm glad you actually said that in the beginning, I really do believe children have been almost the invisible victims that we're not paying attention to. The fact that they've not been in school for 2 years, that they've not been visible to us in terms of what's happened to them. So I think we are only now beginning to uncover some of the data and the horror of what might have been visited on children. A lot of the children who were not in school also did not have access to online, because India has only 4% internet access. So a lot of them have been trafficked either into labor We find that child marriages have gone up, and there is a lot of data to show us that children are in deep distress. But when we come to specifically the issue of orphans, as all of us know, while there is a lot of hype about children who have lost both parents and may now be in the childcare system, either put up for adoption or not, or are living with extended families, there is a much larger number of children who have actually lost a single parent. So, if I look at our focus, we've done a lot of, we are currently focusing on trying to ensure that the children who've lost single parents, where are they? Are they in care? Is the remaining parent still looking after them? If not, are they with extended families? So I was thinking of this example in Rajasthan. We have of two brothers who are now living with their grandparents who can barely make their own ends meet. So the focus has been on connecting them and their foster families on the schemes that have been made available. So I think the big focus we feel should be on both on awareness about the schemes. So, for example, in this case, we've been able to connect them to Protsahan, or been able to connect their grandparents to pensions. Yeah. Also, connection to the PDS system, to all the systems that should provide sustenance for these children across board. Because all of us are in agreement, I think, that we don't want them to move into childcare institutions if possible, if they do have a remaining parent. But they also need to be able to sustain themselves. Some of the worrying things that we are seeing is actually the impact on girl children of staying in extended families. Because I think one of the mythologies that as a country we have to break, it is not necessarily that families, extended families, are safe spaces. The issues on abuse tell us, the data on abuse tell us that this is not true, right? And a lot of the children may be at increased risk within these families of abuse, of people who are. We know people who are working, with the one-stop shelters in the districts, and they are talking of increasing number of adolescent children coming in for help because they are being abused in the care spaces where they're supposed to be safe, like families, extended families, etc. So I think, to me, what is really important is that there needs to be awareness about the schemes. There are different schemes at a central level, and some money has been allocated. If you look at and at states where again some money has been allocated. But overall, there is a worrying trend on child budgets that I would like to point out. While in 2021, Mission Vatsalya has been introduced as an umbrella scheme, but actually when you break it up, the total allocation in the Ministry of Women and Child Development is 1,400 crores, which reflects an increase of about 63.6. There's no doubt about it, from 22. But as a percentage of the total, even just the Ministry of WCD budget, these allocations are only 7.81, and the overall ministry budget has shrunk. So you see that there are some misleading trends in terms of percentage may have increased, but in absolute amounts, the budgets have more or less, adjusting for inflation, remained the same. So in 2021, the ministry had got a budget of 20,000 crores, but in 22-23, it's only got the same thing, has shrunk to about 18.8 or to about 19 crores. So you see what we see is that the resources don't follow the intentions. Yeah? If we say that, if we know that children being out of school for these 2 years, children being in increasingly unprotected situations, requires us to focus at a policy level, then what really surprises us that as a percentage of GDP, our expenditure on child-focused intervention only accounts for 0.34%, 0.34% in 21-22. And somewhere I think to us as organizations, as people, yes, we can do the work of actually ensuring that families access those schemes, but there has to be resources in the schemes in the first place. So some of our work here in the last 2 years, for example, we worked with the ministry in Karnataka, where they lacked resources to even be able to call up or check on the welfare of children who have been reported as having lost parents. Right? So the system itself is struggling with enough resources to do that, and we see the states taking a lot of initiatives. So I'm not going to be all negative. I mean, I look at Telangana, and they're doing some amazing work on tracking the children at least. Yeah. And then, of course, you have your second level of issues, which Smriti so beautifully talked about. That once the children are in care, yeah, who looks at what happens in care? What are the budgets? We saw very panicky sort of reactions. Close down all childcare institutions, send the children home so they don't get care. But there are no homes. Where are they going? So to me, overall, actually, at this time, I would just like to repeat again, there is a need for us to focus on what has happened to children and what we need to do to mitigate it. Combination of civil society organizations and the parts of the system, the wonderful actually ICPS, the JJ Acts that have been put in place, but need resourcing, need money, need realistic additions in terms of money for counseling. So I'm not even, as a country, we are not even going into what we believe are, not so necessary interventions. Acha, khana pina to khila do. But forget, we're not even at psychosocial trauma counseling, which actually children will need. So I think the allocation, to come back to my point about resources being allocated, both at budget and state and central levels, of also equipping the authorities with the resources to roll out the actual tracing, tracking, and working with children. So I can see Sonal is here, so I am super excitedly handing it back to her.
Thank you, Puja. Am I audible?
Just give you context, I talked a little bit about the work in connecting children to schemes, as well as the need for budgetary allocations to the protection of children at this time, which is specifically required. And Smriti, of course, talked about her great issue of children who are sitting in care centers but have, are not able, nobody can adopt them, even though. So there's huge imbalance between demand and supply.
All right. Thank you, Puja, and due apologies to everyone. When you depend on technology a little too much, it just ditches you at the last minute. I would quickly want to bring in, Sudarshan in the conversation. Sudarshan, you often speak about, the role of Save the Children as also as a connector and an aggregator, right, in this space. And Puja did speak about, the need for matching the resources with the intentions. How do you think these conversations, we are talking about children who've lost parents, children who've lost, who have parents who've lost incomes or livelihoods, which is no less than a child losing, one parent, because even the parents who are there and have no jobs, they still are making their children beg. In our case at Protsahan, we have constantly seen children being put up for transactional sex. The need for looking at psychosocial trauma, health, in case of counseling, but then also looking as an aggregator when you're talking about mental health issues at scale. How does this even fit at a policy level or at the level of larger institutions like Save the Children? How do you guys think when you're forming solutions to questions like that? Sudarshan?
Thanks, Sonal. And whatever else in these 2 days, I have progressed marginally on technology in the sense some of these platforms work much better on laptops. So I am there. But also on another kind of half lighter note, we've been reporting, I mean, by we, I mean as a country, that education starting from a challenge eventually as technology driven is showing great attendance, this, that, and all. I would just pause us that look at us and our challenges in getting online and sustaining a connect with each other with all the good support. We still land up into hiccups, and to imagine remote located children, one app, five people sharing, and culturally not oriented into society driven by technology or parents enabled, and to just make a tick box that we are doing well because children have signed in. I think I'm just citing that to say the next point, what I'm afraid of. And I've come here not as representing Save the Children. I want to discuss and debate around child care, the context of child care. First and foremost, what concerns me is we don't even know what we don't know. I mean, some people decided that orphanhood during COVID-19 is the and only issue. Were we doing well with childcare prior to that? Was everything going fine? And was everything going fine attending to children? I think the needle just swung a little higher, but it was alarming already the way this country has made provisions, or lack of it has not. We haven't stood up to our children. We're talking about 40% youth in the country, and all of us, the government, the civil society, organization, the active citizen, we've together as adults fallen way short. So as of today, I would suggest that we, step above, taking positions around the continuum of at home to childcare institution, all of them put together in the bandwidth, we have not been adequate. So we need to strengthen and work at all the levels, preferably starting from the natural home, preventing the parents' loss of life, loss of livelihood, securing the children there. If one or both parents are lost, then who else in their homogeneous society can and is capable of taking? So the much larger issue is, as a society, do we prioritize our children? How important are they in our scheme of things? Puja narrated one illustration of a number, the money that we put in to show how much we care. I think when you look at it relatively, the non-performing asset of a good big bank will put you to shame with that money, the kind of money that we're doing. So combine 25 top banks, their non-performing assets, or maybe throw in a few religious institutions and their surpluses, and I think, hey presto, we should be able to do 10x of childcare than what we are doing today. And I think that is somewhere where we should be headed now. What do we settle for as a country? What is the country which is aiming at Mars? How do we progress for those children who are left behind today? Coming to the larger context, again, both Smriti started with it, and Puja also flagged it in terms of our response system, doing the right thing, getting hyper on WhatsApp or somewhere that four children here, four children, I mean, and doing it the right way. I think, I mean, my take from what Smriti was saying is it's very important for protection, securing, and nurturing of children that you just don't take the right action, but do it the right way. And I think in terms of the processes to be committed to and not swing, and those are that's a very tall order, but I think that's where this collaborative space needs to be activated. I would also say, like, let's say if a budget is provided for adequately, today one will have to run to 23, 24 places at the last count, different windows to fulfill the need of one child holistically. I mean, a lifetime will go into accessing these different windows, from education to health to nutrition to livelihood to various other departments, tribal, non-tribal, this one, that one. So how many different ways we can divide a child and child's needs? Instead of that, we should be doing how many different ways in which we bring all that into one platform. First, one big budget which declares that whatever it takes to bring our children at par with the best, secure them, protect them, provide a learning environment. That budget needs to be provided as a country. All of us have a role to play. Having provided that budget is probably just half of the problem solved. How do we deploy and how do we effectively use it again in the whole continuum? And I think all of us need to have a role to play in it. The government can provide budget, the government can open system, but the last mile connectivity with the child should be by whoever is best positioned there. Could be a department of government, could be the Anganwadi worker, could be the ASHA worker, could be one of our NGOs. We shouldn't compartmentalize there. I mean, we need to make sure this child needs to get the best of us to go there. From what Smriti flagged earlier and Puja flagged earlier, when the wrong hands reach with even the right resources, the consequences can be much worse. So those decision making, the way of doing things, we could be liberating that. I mean, but for that, the starting point is we need to be alarmed. We need to be saying that 40% population children, and we don't have a commensurate plan to respond as a country, as a priority. We are too top heavy. I mean, we are adult centric, and we don't even have children as stakeholders in any of our planning for the children. We just don't respect that view. I think we need to bring that needle back, start off both in letter and spirit, and then build from there. So I think the issue is way beyond orphaning that has happened in last 2 years. That's just a consequence of everything else. It's not by
Yeah.
itself an only issue. Back to you, Sonal. Lot more to say, but I guess a lot of people and there. So yeah.
No, that's really I love the piece, Sudarshan, where you spoke about that. When will we start looking at children as a whole? And this conversation, this point becomes even more relevant because as civil society, when you're donor facing, the donors, the CSRs, sometimes they want to fund only the digital devices ka access piece of it. Sometimes they only want to look at we will look at only the academic piece of it. Sometimes they only want to, and anyone, if you say let's look at a child holistically, the first, I think, resistance is the one, is from a space which has all the resources to even get started in that domain. I'm sure the civil society understands these pieces. Also the fact that when we speak about funding for advocacy, when we speak about funding for psychosocial trauma healing pieces, I remember just 3 days back, Sudarshan, we were having a chat with one of the non-profit consulting
Hmm.
arms somewhere, and the consultant tells us, I have no idea. These are the exact words, and I want to put
Hmm.
it on the table. I have no idea what trauma healing and psychosocial pieces that you're talking about,
Hmm.
for a child who's faced incest, or for a child who's faced, orphanhood, irrespective of COVID or without COVID, but facing orphanhood.
Hmm.
I don't understand the trauma healing piece, but I want to do some deep blue sky thinking for scale. And, sometimes I think it amazes me that we haven't gotten our approach for one child correct, and we are looking
Yeah.
at scale. Scale, of course, is important in a country like ours. We have to, and I think I'll bring
Absolutely.
Sole. Yeah, I'll
Hmm.
bring Sole here. Sole, if you can also speak about, kind of marrying these two approaches of, some of these pieces where UNICEF has done some absolutely fantastic work in collaboration with either the Bal Sangopan piece in Maharashtra or the Palanhad piece in Rajasthan, where you've also helped some of the smaller pieces who are looking at holistic change in a child's life, holistic change in the development of a child, from a child-centric lens. And how are some of these best practices for the most vulnerable child? You're looking at it from a scale, if I dare use that word, perspective. Sole?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks again. Thanks so much, Sonal, and fantastic panel. Such a privilege to be with all of you. So just trying to share a few thoughts to your very easy question, right? That can be addressed very quickly. And I'm just being some ironic here. But perhaps just to take it where Sudarshan just left, I think if we are to really perhaps uphold the best interest of the child principle, right? And we are all having today a fantastic panel with child protection practitioners. We know that that's the cornerstone of every intervention and is a customary international principle founded in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which is pretty much universally accepted. In order to do that, Sonal, as you're saying, it's very important that we look both at the system and environment at the very broad level, and I'm talking here about legal and policy frameworks that are necessary for a child to be protected and thrive. But of course, we know that policies and frameworks and documents will not make a difference, right? I think the previous panelists talked very eloquently about the importance of budget allocation, right, which is very critical, about the importance of having a child protection service that operates in the same fashion that could be any other basic service, right? You have the education service, you have the health service that is adequately resourced, where it's clearly the ratio of funding allocation and workforce vis-a-vis the population. And a similar thing needs to be set in place vis-a-vis the social services, even more so when it comes to child protection. There's been progress in the country, and we need to acknowledge that, but we know that it's still a long way to go for the child protection social services to be really recognized, to be resourced, to be professionalized. We know that there is a lot of problems with how the child protection workforce operates, and a lot of them have a contractual contract, and still we are not yet there when it comes to a fully professionalization of the system. Now, even in the best case scenario, when you have the ecosystem working with the legal policy frameworks and the systems, still, if we don't have in place community and family-based programs, and I really want to spend a little bit of time about the role of the families here. If we don't spend time working with the communities and families that are most vulnerable, no matter how much that ecosystem will be effective, we will not be able to reach the objective, Sonal, that you were saying about reaching the most vulnerable. So Sudarshan was mentioning about the digital divide. This is, of course, it's come so much in our face, right, as a result of COVID. We know that, and this is just one of the many figures that we have, but at least 70 million people fell into poverty, right? That's almost 2 times the size of my own country, right? And this just happened on the brink of a public health crisis. We also know that this didn't happen in isolation, right? We know that according to multidimensional poverty analysis, 1 out of 3 children in the country are already poor. So, this has just come on top of the vulnerable situation of many communities and families. As the previous panelists were saying, yes, it might not be enough work on social protection schemes, but definitely if a family is not back on their feet, and if they have no meat and if they have no food on the plate at the end of the day, we can only imagine what things unfold, right? It means higher level of tensions, distress, domestic violence. It means all sorts of negative coping mechanisms start being resorted. The child ends up in child labor. They end up in a quick marriage, being a child, because they just need one more mouth to be taken away. Or even some of them might decide to initiate some dangerous journeys seeking labor, and therefore also end up being trafficked, as we know. Only in the course of the COVID situation, with partners, some of which are here in this conversation, more than 2,800 child marriages and 7,000 cases of child trafficking through the partners were prevented. And I'm just talking about the small sample that, as UNICEF, we were able to sort of witness and collaborate. The importance of the family as the first line of defense cannot be emphasized enough. And unfortunately, what we will not want as adults, it is justice for children. Yeah. What I'm saying here is that a lot of times children, whenever they are in a very vulnerable situation, they end up being institutionalized. And I think Smriti was also talking about really the drama of so many children that are lagging in institutions as we speak today, just because of the socioeconomic situation of the families. I remember a study from 2018 from the Ministry of Women and Child Development that already states that around 50% of the children in childcare institutions are there because of the socioeconomic conditions, or that at least one out of the three children have at least one living parent. If you remove a child from their family environment, you are already putting that child in such a huge disadvantage. We know that family is the natural environment for any to grow, to thrive, to socialize, to get socialized, to get emotional connections. It is the most important safety net that any person can naturally have, and it's also where not only the cognitive but also the emotional development really takes place. And there has been already a lot of studies that point of the damaging of institutionalization as a result of that. I think we focus on that because the focus on the panel was around orphanhood, and I think also Puja was mentioning that there's been, and it's important also to recognize that the government put significant amount of schemes in place, which was a welcoming step, right? At least UNICEF worked with 12 of those schemes, 11 of which had a component on education, right? We know the importance of education. However, we know that many schemes there are problems of fragmentation, right? We know that the social protection ecosystem in the country is very diverse, but the opportunities to connect the dots among them remains a problem. Even more so, there are problems of access in the context of, again, of COVID orphan children. There was a lot of problems, even because of the fact of having to demonstrate that you were orphan because of the COVID situation, right? Which also presents some challenges when it comes to principles of equality and discrimination. But then perhaps the point that I will want to emphasize a little bit more is that economic support will not be enough, right? We're talking about very vulnerable families. If we don't connect social protection cash transfer schemes with what we call oftentimes the cash plus, right? Linkages to services, linkages to mental health and psychosocial support, ensuring that there is a linkage with education. I'm here not proposing at all that there are conditionalities on the transfers. And, global evidence has also shown that at the end, you are going to end up probably putting penalties to the families that are the most vulnerable. So it's not about putting conditionalities to the social protection and cash transfers, but rather making sure that we come holistically to help the child and the family that is really in a vulnerable situation. I'll just highlight again, and I'll conclude, Sonal, by saying that we need to really put more focus on prevention. We cannot wait until a child hits the door of the system, right, of the JJR. We cannot wait until a child comes in the CWC, DCPU, to become a so-called children in need of care and protection, because by then we are acting way too far and way too late. We need to have robust prevention programs, much more of community-based child protection committees, working with Grand Child, working with the community structures that can do an early identification of vulnerable children, that can incorporate prevention programs to prevent violence, to promote psychosocial support and others, and not wait until it becomes too late.
Thank you, Sole. I think some larger pieces, that you touched upon have been extremely critical. You did speak about why we need to, and I think even Sudarshan and Puja highlighted these pieces, why we need to look at social protection as a prerequisite for child protection. Point number one. Point number two, also, when we are looking at a lot of these schemes, a lot of these policy welfare measures that have been taken by the state governments and the government at the center, we oftentimes forget that we have to look at the child as a whole, and I think that is the difference, and that's the problem point also, because everything we are trying to provide as a knee-jerk reaction, we are trying to provide as a need-based sort of a support system and not as a rights-based thinking lens. Because I think when we look at child protection from a rights-based angle, a lot of these holistic pieces, a lot of these pieces on intersectionality, a lot of these pieces on vulnerability mapping kind of just come together, and we can look at solutions for children in a much more integrated manner. And I think, again, I would want to kind of give an example from the ground to what Sole was mentioning, these convergence of all these pieces and why this is important. And again, kind of taking it back to the conversation, a lot of the audience who might be joining us, might be feeling that why are we talking about child's vulnerability as a whole and not as much as on the orphanhood piece. But the practitioners, the civil society, people here in the space, we have seen it that this is one space where we cannot separate just the COVID orphanhood piece from the child vulnerability piece, and these are not two separate pieces. Why? I'll give you an example. So we were looking at Protsahan, for example. We work in communities, extremely community-based systems, and we were looking at two specific cases. And I would try to kind of hit a parallel, by comparing these two, if I dare can. There was one case where a sister and a brother, siblings, have lost parents to COVID. First parent dies in the first COVID wave. The second parent dies in the second COVID wave. And these two children, so there was a lot of pressure from the community, from the media that, push these children into institutional care. And the only thing we fought for was that there was a dadi and a dada, that is paternal grandfather and paternal grandmother, for these two siblings who are more than ready and willing and welcoming to kind of take care of these children very organically. The kinship care, the family strengthening piece that Sole spoke about, I think that automatically kicked in from a community basis, right? And of course, there were CWC checks and etc. And they were considered fit to be immediately taken in by the paternal grandfather and grandmother. So here is this family, or here are these two children who've lost parents to COVID and understand their vulnerability, where a paternal grandfather and a grandmother come in to support immediately. Versus there's another family, 3 girls that we've been supporting for a bit. And the mother is stuck to bed because of COVID. She cannot move out. This was in the second COVID wave, mid last year. And the father, who does not have access to his wife for sex, has started raping his 5, 6, and 14-year-old daughters. Right? Now, in this case, the parents have not been lost to COVID or to other pieces. The parents are very much alive. But if we are not looking in the child protection piece from a lens of vulnerability mapping, I think we are doing disservice to the children in general. I'll quickly want to bring in, put a question, and then the panelists can take it up as an open question. A lot of times we do hear these. Whenever we are working in a child protection space, we have to look at healing. We have to look at empathy. We have to look at holistic pieces that I think almost everybody spoke about. But when you look at the people or the agencies or the organizations or the system or the donors or, the system, the government per se, leave alone the donors, the convergence at every level is missing, right? There are, of course, deep conversations about scale. If you look at the edtech companies, they have grown massively in the last 1.5, 2 years. Just 2 days back, we got a proposal from somewhere that, hey, edtech is growing crazily. Come, we want to reach out to your set of... And we were thinking, those children don't even have digital devices, right? So where is this empathy missing? How can we, in the child protection space, dare to make our systems empathetic? Of course, with technology pieces flown in, with the rights-based pieces flown in. But can we dare look at or give examples of the work that each of us have done or, kind of read maybe, where systems can be dared to make empathetic to understand the most vulnerable child's real issues? Smriti, we can quickly come up with you with a minute each, and then we can look at towards the closing of the piece. Smriti.
Okay, sure, Sonal. I don't know if it directly address your question, but it's something interesting that I was thinking about a few days back. So, taking the discussion a little bit from the lighter side, as I'm an adoptive parent, so anything that comes out in the media related to adoption, right? I always consume it, whether it's movies, TV shows, etc. So, in streaming services, this movie came out some time back called Instant Family. It's a US based movie where kids go into foster care and eventually get adopted. So I saw that movie. Like I said, as an adoptive parent, I was curious, but what I was left with after I watched the movie, it wasn't the story itself, right? Story is well done, it's all good. What I was left with is this idea that these children, they're constantly being looked after by very specific caseworkers who are responsible for their welfare end to end. So these children were not being handed over, right? Like, oh, you are this government official's problem now, you're that person's problem now. No, they had assigned people who will make sure that from the time that their primary, life with their biological mother is disrupted, from that point onwards, as they go through the foster care system, as they go through this period of perhaps going back to their mother, from their coming back into the foster care system and going through adoption, right? At no point the system stops until the child is with a permanent family. And that was my biggest takeaway. And that's the biggest difference I saw in what we see on the ground when we do our work is the system just keeps stopping. It keeps stopping at different abrupt points, right? It's almost like, oh, the child's file is with, X official. So now that system has stopped there for them. Now that child may move from there to another, to let's say another NGO or another organization or anybody on the ground, whether you're talking about implementation officers, whether you're talking about decision-making officials, whether you're talking about shelters, whosoever you're talking about. It's almost like everybody has a big piece of their job, which they're supposed to do, and the child has to somehow move through this jigsaw puzzle of whose job is to do what until they come to an ending that hopefully will work for the child. And I find that so disjointed, so distracting. Like, no wonder the kids don't move through the system. Anybody in this jigsaw puzzle sitting somewhere who has to do one task may delay it, may not do it, may not have the resources to do it or the training to do it, and the child is stuck right there. So I would say, I think we talked about making the systems more empathetic. To me, it has to be this continuous end-to-end consideration of a child's life. So you gave a few examples, one in which the children lost both parents, another case in which the father is abusing the daughters. In all of these systems, there has to be, the end goal has to be a safe, permanent family, right? Or a safe, permanent situation, even if it's in a group home or in a long-term shelter, whatever the case may be. But are we tracking this case day by day on a daily basis? And who's that single person responsible to make sure that the children come to a good conclusion for them? And I feel that's one big part missing. We have this, these policies and these perhaps schemes, these officials, NGOs, a lot of hands that the children has to move through. But there is no consistent one person or one authority whose responsibility it is, like a end-to-end caseworker for one child only type of responsibility, where the child is taken care of from the point where the child becomes vulnerable to the point where the child is whole again and no longer vulnerable.
In fact, Smriti, I would quickly want to add on to this piece that you again very, very importantly highlighted. Sometimes when we are trying to make systems empathetic, and there have been cases where, for example, in Delhi, it's as strange as it can get. In most parts of the country, where a child who's undergoing, this entire system of a POXO support person has kicked in, a child who's been abused sexually, and she's now being supported by the state or the systems, and different actors are now coming in. In Delhi, there are cases where, or most of the cases where a child who's been sexually abused, she has more than, or he has more than enough case support persons, right? So ideally, and there in Assam, in West Bengal, in Odisha, there is not even one support person for the child, who can take the child and the family through the entire court system or the entire process of compensation and so on and so forth, under the protection of child. People who are joining in, who don't understand POXO as an acronym, it's a protection of children from sexual offences. And I think in Delhi, you have more than enough people to support. And at every time, the child has to give their testimony, kind of all over again to that news for support person that's coming in to support. So there have been also times when, in the want of becoming empathetic, there have been too much happening, and again, that's spoiling everything for the child. Again, when we speak about these people who are supporting children in the child protection frameworks in different spaces inside the system, there have been cases. In fact, again, I speak about Delhi. I don't even know what the situation will be in other remote parts of the country. This is the capital city of the country that we talk about. That the EVGC counselors, right, the counselors who are kind of attached to the government schools. One counselor is attached to about 3 to 4 to 5 government schools. So any case of disclosure that comes in, any case of violence that comes in within the government school system, it is this counselor that can, that has the power to kind of take the child through the transition process of, this journey of listening and believing in the child, making them, get referrals and linkages and counseling and so on and so forth. And these counselors, as a full-time job, are paid less than 5,000 rupees a month. They're expected to do everything without the cover of Provident Fund or ESIs. They're contractual workers. And then again, we expect, that our most vulnerable children will be supported. The system, and I think I again come back to Puja. Resources, there are intentions, but the match between the two is lacking. Puja and Sudarshan, how do you think we can make the systems empathetic for where it would really make sense for that child and the family?
When you were talking about empathetic systems, what was jumping to my head were individuals, right?
Puja, are you
We
on
have
mute by any
met.
chance?
No.
I can hear Puja.
We can hear you.
We can hear you, Puja.
You're audible. You're audible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then it must be me. Okay, sorry.
Oh dear. Yeah. So I think two things. One was, of course, Sonal, always what jumps to mind is individuals. Yeah, individuals who are in that system and yet seem to be miraculously human and more than human. I remember meeting a judge in fact, it was in Delhi that she was able to put child friendly courts into place, and she's now posted to Kashmir. So we hope something will happen there. So, one piece of hope that I have seen through my many, many years is really when we look at institutions and they actually become individuals or humans. Yeah, if we are willing to acknowledge that they may be able to be different, make changes, that I always see as a beacon of hope. Of course, many times the system beats them down. There's no question about that. But that's something that I see. And the other thing that I feel, Sonal, is that, it's one thing to say, how do you make a system empathetic? But the heart of it lies in how to make the system accountable to the child, to that community. That is where, unfortunately, change lies. Yeah? How do you, because a child has, as we all know, where are children's voices? They're not even voting citizens. Yeah. So how do we make those systems accountable? And one of the processes that we have found, at least in CRY, is in pushing the holistic, actually looking at children as holistic beings, where you don't intervene just with children, but you're ensuring that the communities around them are becoming the activists on their behalf. In the end, it will be those adults who will be able to hold, for example, a village child protection committee responsible. And I come back to, we heard this from Soledad, we heard this from Sudarshan, that if we focused on vulnerability, on prevention, that is the time at which we could preempt a lot of the horrors that may happen in the system. To me, creating empathy in adults, understanding in duty bearers actually should be part of every organization, every person, every person who is individual who's concerned about children. It has to be an overtly stated part of our agendas with strategies to match. and resources to match. So coming back to, for example, the village child protection committees are in the law, but there is no budget. Only West Bengal, interestingly, actually has a budget for these. So to me, it is about that. We build empathy with creating accountability. We look if we can break this up into individuals, and coming back to the fact that all of this needs to be resourced. If you have temporary contract workers who are always looking for the next thing that may give them a slightly better income, how are we going to work with them? And yet they are the ones who saved us during COVID, no? All of us have miracle stories of Anganwadi workers who walked with, 5 kilos of grain on their heads. We have miracle stories of nurses who are underpaid contract workers, actually looking out for families and ensuring they were hospitalized. So I think to me, that is where our hope sort of lies.
Sonal.
Right.
Sonal, have we lost you?
No, I believe Miss Sonal is still here, but I
Yes.
hate to interrupt to what seems like a very intellectually stimulating, very great discussion. And I like how each speaker is not just helping us to develop a child-sensitive lens, but there is this semblance of intersectionality that is coming with it. And I absolutely really appreciate that. I request the moderator to please move to the Q&A panel. Our attendees have put in a lot of questions there. So let's quickly move to that before we head to our main launch. Sonal, may I please request you, ma'am?
Yes. Epsita, you'll have to read out the questions.
Right. So I will
apologize because I have to take leave. Unfortunately, I'm late for the meeting. So I'm going to leave. But before I do that, to sincerely appreciate for this opportunity to share some thoughts about this important issue. Many thanks again, and wishing our foundation all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Soledad.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you so much. Right. So I'll be redirecting the questions completely open to the floor. Any speaker is open to take them up. The first question that we've received is, how can the below poverty line children access these resources? I think the attendee wants to ask what is the one way through which the below poverty line children can get, who've been recently orphaned, can go and access the resources that can help them.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I think if I can quickly pitch in, one thing we'll have to realize that people for whom a lot of these schemes are meant for, they are not on social media, right? And we have to
Exactly.
understand that we saw a lot of adoption calls. It's just insane how we expect people or children who've been orphaned, for that matter, to have immediate access. It's a child's protection piece is not the child's problem. It's the adult's problem, or the adult's.
Absolutely.
I think it's on us and every adult around. So if you have people or access to resources, make sure you just send them a printout. The local CWCs, the local child welfare committees, the local DCPUs. How many of us know that there are 10 CWCs in Delhi, right? All of 10 CWCs in whole of Delhi, right? And just a little Google search will give you the phone number. And these CWCs really work. How many of us understand the system before conveying it to the child? So I think for the poor kid to access these pieces, we as adults need to widen our awareness systems and horizons, so that these pieces of information go where they have to go. And before the close of this entire thing, I think everybody should commit to memory this phone number, this child helpline number, 1098-1098. For
Absolutely.
any child you see in distress, it's not a Save the Children or a Cry or a Protsahan or a Where Are India's Children that you have to reach out to, or a UNICEF. You have to reach out to 1098. That's the number where all of us are going to stand by and have our solutions and questions actually heard.
Thanks. That answers it quite comprehensively. I hope the attendee heard your answer. The next question
Yeah.
is by...
I'd like just to reiterate that 1098 will then connect you to the system. They have the mandate to do so. Arbitrarily calling some other organization, we may not even be mandated to do it.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. The next question is, has anything been done for deaf children? This person has talked about their own experience of dealing with deaf children and has said that sadly they haven't seen many such interventions being done for deaf children who got affected by COVID-19 pandemic and orphaned by COVID-19 pandemic. So can anybody shed some light on the same?
I can take that. Actually, specifically when we, I know as a panel, perhaps we also use a lot of jargon, but when we say the words intersectionality, this is exactly what we mean. Children are marginalized, first by poverty, then it could be gender, then it might be disability, it could be mental health, it could be autism. I mean, it could be caste, it is my religion very often. And unfortunately, our response systems do not have specific categories or specific responses unless the policy makers involved actually focus on that set of children. So you're right. I mean, if deaf children were an issue, imagine what has happened to visually challenged children. What has happened to children who've been deprived of, maybe they had a school that they could go to if you're autistic, but now you're at home with adults who are not qualified and not able to look after the children. So, no, I'm so sorry, but there has not been any specific response to any different kind of additional marginalization of this sort.
Right.
I'll quickly, if I can just jump in, to add on to, and I absolutely concur with what Puja is saying. But there have been a little few, there's a beautiful cat mewing in the background. So also hello to her. I think we also have to understand, some system has also come up with some beautiful and amazing practices, best practices, I think, where, for example, the Delhi government, with support from DCPCR, and I think Anurag Kundu and Akshay Churmani are the people behind this piece, who have worked so hard to establish an early warning response system and connected them with the government school piece across the government schools in Delhi. They've been able to, so DCPCR and the Delhi government have been able to save, if you can use that word, almost 1,600 children with absolutely vulnerabilities, like the question asked, whether the child is hearing impaired, whether the child cannot see, whether the child is facing a violence and abuse at home, whether the child in intersectionality of any and every kind, and a special focus has been put there where using technology, the question, if a child is more absent for more than 2 or 3 days in continuation, that little app with the phone number of the parent, kind of put in it, the message goes to that parent saying that आपका बच्चा आज स्कूल नहीं आया, हम आशा करते हैं सब ठीक तो है. 4 दिन बाद again the message goes, after 5 days of absence there's another kind of message that goes. After a week of absence there is a home visit that this is, school system makes. So I think we have to understand, as a system, there are deep intersectionalities that our children face. But if we are looking at as a system to respond, again, with empathy, with accountability, we need to also use technology so that, responses and solutions can go out to reach more children than just a group of children facing such vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Sonal, because that's a typical firefly intervention. That imagine if we were able to scale across all states.
Yeah.
It wouldn't take much.
And it's just a tech platform, if you think of it. And 1,600 children have been saved in the last 8 months.
Yeah,
right.
Sometimes it just
right.
takes.
So we have 3 questions that, due to the possibility of time, I'll have to club them. But in the nutshell, they all ask about how can more and more awareness be created regarding this issue. Since we've touched upon that a lot, we've talked about it. So what are the mediums through which the awareness regarding this can be created? Please, ma'am.
So, Sonal, would you like to take it, or Sudarshan? I mean, awareness is one of the things that at CRY we actually see as one of our most important strategies, right? So I think it ranges from what we as people concerned about children try to put and see is in media, right? In traditional media, in non-traditional media, and we need resources to ensure that these invisibilities of children are talked about, that they come up. I mean, look at the small thing of the role that the media played. Some of us were concerned that they're only playing it vis-a-vis orphans. But if they had played the same role vis-a-vis children getting married because of COVID, or children getting into labor. So I think awareness is a very big piece in terms of how do we ensure people become aware as privileged society as well as at the community level. Yeah, as parents, as duty bearers of marginalized children. So there are different strategies for each level, and to my mind, not that expensive. I saw organizations unfortunately put crores of money into advertising for COVID awareness. But if we put that same crore into advertising about the domestic violence happening within homes, we put the same crores into awareness on what is happening to Smriti's issue, which is children sitting in institutions when they actually have no caregiver. So I think the need for us as a society to start talking, having conversations about something other than religion and oh, mandir banna chahiye ya nahi. I mean, it flummoxes me. Here is 40%, 340 million children in this country are we did a statistical projection, and we realized 1 billion children will pass through in the next 10 years in India, the age group of 14 to 18.
Wow.
Can you imagine these numbers? Yeah. And to do that, we need to put those resources. And organizations who are, willing to come in and say, no, I won't just put money on ye bacche ko bacha do, right? Lekin I will prevent that child from falling into the river in the first place. Can we be more conscious and can we vote with our feet and our hands for children's issues? So, to build that awareness, I think, is a responsibility of this entire society. Yeah? And as civil society, we can't keep saying, oh, nobody funds it, and so we can't do it. Oh, we can do it. Social media has been terrible in the hands of spreading bad attitudes. It can be equally great in spreading good attitudes. So, yeah, you touched upon something I feel very strongly about, as you can see.
And I think the person who's asked this question, I have no idea who that is. When in the evening you go back home, I'm guessing you're a young, motivated person. When in the evening you go back home, make a reel about the 1098, make an Instagram reel or a Twitter story or a Twitter community spaces. I don't know the kind of stuff that you guys know that we oldies don't, but I think make something. You have the power of phones in your hand, right? Next time you're volunteering at a shelter home, next time you're volunteering, don't operate from a space of हम आज यहाँ दान करने आए हैं. We are हमारी औकात ही नहीं है to say that we are the givers of हम with the needs based approaches of again understanding child protection, right? Smriti's issue, again, Smriti, I'll quickly pass on the mic back to you. This piece about how do we bring in awareness on the legal adoption piece, which again was completely lacking, for example, in the context of COVID.
So I agree with both of you. I don't think like there is that much more a thing I have to add there, but I do think that overall public awareness that children need to be protected, and it's not okay for children not to be protected. I think that is the awareness we have to build. I think there's a certain level of passiveness. I think that gets built in, and not to blame the people or society for it. I think it gets built in when everything is too overwhelming. If I'm going down the street and there, a 10th street kids begging, right? As a single human being, what can I do? What are the resources I have? And all that. So it just, I think a lot of times people look at the issues related to children in India, like I'm talking about a general layperson, and they may get easily overwhelmed. And a lot of it, I think, spreading awareness, spreading information about what you can do, howsoever little it is, or to know what are the options out there, can actually really help. I used to say, during COVID, we used to get these phone messages. Before you could talk to the other person, you will have to hear this entire recorded message about COVID. So why aren't we doing this for children? Every single time I make a call to somebody, there should be a recorded message which says, if you have, a child in trouble, call 1098 as soon as the number you have, right? If you're visiting child shelters and so on, before you distribute the Parle-G biscuits or anything, build some rapport with the staff. Ask them, are they putting abandoned and orphan children into the legal adoption process? How many kids are there? Do they need any help? Do they need any resources? Right? So that's something else. And even small resources that may be available, state-wise or city-wise. So there's a lot we can do to build general public awareness. Like, there are a lot of things I learned today, for example, that certain governments are doing that I didn't. And I'm sure there are certain governments are doing certain things in the areas where we are working, or there are maybe even some of the other NGOs working. Right? So I feel like it's like at least we can take a common message out so that the whole idea of protecting children is not so overwhelming. So it feels doable. Once people feel it's doable, once that awareness is there, like child abandonment. It's a very simple awareness message. Surrender a child in an adoption agency. You do not throw the child in a garbage. You do not need to throw the child in a river. But these very simple, small public awareness things would kind of focus people's brains back into the idea that children can be protected. It is not something overwhelming. It's not something not doable. It is very doable. There are some things in place, and this is what we do. So yes, that's
right. Okay, so our beneficiaries have reached office, and but this was a brilliant discussion.
Are there any more questions,
Thank you
Rashida?
so much.
Or we can look at
Thank you so much to
towards
all of
the
you.
closure of
I
this panel.
request all of you to proceed to our third session, wherein we'll be meeting our children directly. And so, thank you for your organization. Thank you for the brilliant insights we received today. Thank you, Ms. Sonal, Ms. Smriti, and Ms. Puja Marwaha, ma'am. The other two speakers have left. Let's proceed on to the third session where we, initiate our main policy launch and meet the children beneficiaries. Right? Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, attendees.
All the best for your launch. Thank you very much.
Bye.
It was a pleasure meeting everyone here and having these conversations with people who are in the same boat, right? Fighting for children's rights and fighting for the fact that we as adults are the protectors, not them.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Bye, Smriti. Bye, Puja.